Welcome to The Paradox with your attending, Dr. Eric Larson. He is a practicing anesthesiologist and clinical assistant professor at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine. Listen in as he takes you behind the scenes of what practicing medicine in today's ever-changing world is like with another doctor. The Paradox is a fun and accidentally informative show for physicians, patients, or anyone who has ever found themselves in a waiting room.
Imagine yourself in California at a clearing in a large forest, and it's on fire. There are three groups of people who stand before you. A large group is screaming and running around, pointing at the fire. They're yelling that we need to do something, anything we can to stop the fire. Meanwhile, there's another group, not as large, with their backs to the fire. They're mocking, ridiculing the group, running around, panicking. They tell them to calm down and stop ordering people around. They insist there isn't anything wrong at all. Of course, the largest group of people are standing between those groups and looking behind those panicking at an intact forest, and behind the ones who don't notice the giant flames looking at their backs. These people aren't sure what to do, but in the interest of safety, feel that it's probably smartest to get away from the flames, and it's probably the right decision at this point. They tend to stand with a group that's worried. Obviously, this analogy describes our current situation with COVID-19 in America. Most are not one of the screamed groups, but we either identify with the one on the left standing and sure what to do or what to think. What needs to be done, and what I did with my friend David Graham in April of 2020, is to try and be reflective and better understand what it is that we're dealing with. What are the biological, historical, and medical facts or suppositions that we can make to understand this pandemic? If we return to our analogy of the forest fire, it would be best if we could somehow hop up in a hot air balloon and look down at the situation to assess what would be the best individual actions and the true scope of the problem. History and biology could be used to understand the nature of the fires, how they spread, what you do to stop them, and what they're likely to do in their course. Contrary to public opinion, we have some rough ideas about what happens in pandemics and where we will end up. And that is a critical fact that we have to accept. Those in all camps and in between, because if we get that wrong, then we get everything else wrong. The critical question we must ask is, what is the end point for this pandemic? What is the biological consequence of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, and its effect on humans? We have to agree on the ultimate endpoint in order to get our policies and strategies right for surviving this pandemic. What became obvious to us in April of last year was that this virus, despite some government efforts at the time, would become endemic. It would join the other 4 coronaviruses that currently cause the common cold as a virus that will circulate forever throughout the human population. It will not get eradicated. It will infect everyone, probably multiple times throughout your life. This is the biological history of endemic viruses, especially coronaviruses. It really is the way all these common respiratory viruses operate. Rhinovirus, adenovirus, parainfluenza virus. They infect your upper respiratory tract, nose, sinus, mouth, and cause a cold because, although you don't have enough antibodies to prevent infection, because they've waned over time or it's a new variant that looks different enough to evade your antibody response, you have memory B and T cells that mount a quick response after infection to prevent a systemic or lower respiratory tract infection, like pneumonia. We know you get this immunity as a child, and anyone who has kids knows small children are always sick, with runny noses as they are constantly exposed to these different cold viruses, which builds up their long-term immunity to them when exposed later in life. The mRNA vaccines are a medical miracle and trick your body into generating an immune response. It's not magical, except for the technology, and an elegant way to get your body to do the work so when it sees a real virus in the wild, it will seek it out and destroy it. But respiratory viruses often infect us before we can mount a complete immune response, so you get sick and can transmit the virus. This isn't a failure. Your body has done what it needs to do. And so is the virus, which just wants to reproduce and move to the next host. We live in an equilibrium with these viruses. We develop immunity when we're young, so if we're exposed when we're older, we can prevent really bad outcomes. But we get sick and the virus continues to circulate in the world's population, with different viruses coming and going. It's a sort of dance. So what does all this have to do with our wildfire? Well, we know this thing will burn until there isn't any fuel. And fuel is considered people without immunity to the virus. There are only 2 ways to get immunity: a vaccine or infection. Until the virus has burned all the fuel, it will continue to burn. There is nothing we can do to stop it. We might slow it down, We might find ways to treating the fuel on fire, although most treatments for viruses are not very good, but ultimately everyone is going to get it. What does history tell us about coronaviruses? Well, until SARS-CoV-2, we had 4 endemic coronaviruses that cause colds. SARS-CoV-2 will obviously be the 5th. The youngest is OC43, which researchers believe jumped from cows to humans sometime in the late 1800s. This is also the same time as the Russian flu, working its way around the world. So perhaps that flu was actually a coronavirus. If so, OC43 caused a lot more problems back then than it does now, especially if humans were older and naive to the virus, according to the news reports that you can find in various papers from the time. But by now, we've all had multiple infections with OC43 and its variants, from when we were kids to today, where we usually feel terrible for a few days or maybe a week. Over time, the virus does mutate towards becoming more benign and infectious, but that usually takes a long time. Anyway, it serves as a useful roadmap for what might happen to us in our biological dance with this new unwelcome visitor. We also know that immunity to these respiratory viruses wanes over time, either with natural infections or vaccines. The only way you can develop better immunity is through booster shots or infections. But what we really care about, ending up in the hospital, is focused almost entirely on the non-immune. This is a nasty bug. It affects the obese and elderly the most, and it isn't going anywhere. It has definitely killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. So this gets us to the important policy considerations. If we know that it's endemic, which was obvious over a year ago, then how should we approach our public health? Obviously, the only point of slowing the spread at this time is if you could get those without any immunity, no infection and no vaccine, vaccinated to minimize the number of people clogging up our hospitals. But you can't get to a vaccination rate that will stop the spread of the virus. There is no herd immunity threshold, no number of vaccinated and immune to perfectly prevent its spread. Besides the fact that our ability to slow the spread is questionable anyway, it just doesn't make a difference in the end. We're all going to get this virus. Somewhere there's a date with you and me with this virus. Whether you've been vaccinated or not, you will most assuredly get infected. If you have some immunity through a vaccine or previous natural infection, you're much less likely to get very sick. So mandating vaccines, if we agree that it was wise and just, wouldn't matter much except to those who are vaccinated. It may slow the spread and delay the next time they're exposed, but they'll still get it when their immunity wanes, and again and again. If your mitigation measures worked, all you do right now is extend the time it takes for everyone to get immunity, unless you believe you can convince those who won't get immunized to get the vaccine. Even so, that only really benefits those who've chosen to not protect themselves, while inconveniencing everyone else and taking away a lot of rights and simple joys of life. It's easy to see how we got here. Mission creep is not just something that happens in the military. It happens in public policy too. By believing that we could prevent people from getting infected, we've embarked on a strategy that is unwinnable and with no clear endpoint. There's a preponderance of evidence that people can get reinfected multiple times, with COVID and after vaccination. Both through research and observational data, we know that infections with SARS-CoV-2 will continue to happen forever, whether you're vaccinated or not, whether you have had it before or recovered, and no matter where in the world you live. Fundamentally, we've been chasing a zero-COVID strategy in almost every aspect of our society. Obviously, vaccines are a great idea for those who are at risk. I like to point out to how giving chickenpox, varicella, as an adult is a completely different experience for an adult than it is a child. Adults can die from chickenpox, whereas kids almost never do. Also, an infection with varicella puts you at risk of getting shingles later in life, which can cause pain and a host of other problems. This is one reason why we vaccinate children for chickenpox. But clearly, vaccination, since we know it won't stop transmissions in its tracks, no matter how high the rate is a strategy to keep people out of the hospital and free up hospital resources for other things, like heart attacks, strokes, cancer, etc. Masks, lockdowns, testing, and quarantining, and any other mitigation efforts are zero-COVID policies, which are of dubious efficacy and ultimately make no difference since we all get infected eventually. The most sensible reason to resist vaccine mandates, masking rules, and various lockdown measures in the United States at this point is because they're attempting to stop what cannot be stopped. Even 60% of the deer in my state of Michigan have had COVID and serve as a reservoir for the virus along with mice. SARS-CoV-2 is not going anywhere, so acting like you can keep it out is akin to wrapping yourself with a towel when you go swimming to stay dry. Perhaps you could argue that you're waiting until there's a childhood vaccine, But that might take months or years until you get large enough numbers of kids' parents, to get their kids vaccinated. What target are you looking at? It is exceedingly rare for kids to get really sick with this virus. Do these measures justify affecting their socialization and education and all the other aspects of life that we take for granted? Is it worth having every child see other people as disease vectors rather than unique individuals to whom they can get to know, collaborate, love, play, and innovate? Some might argue that the infirm or immunocompromised, like those with solid organ transplants, are at risk, and we should encourage vaccination to protect them. Again, the vaccinated can still spread the virus, and the only thing vaccination does is frees up hospital resources, which is important. However, once people have had the infection, once or maybe twice, they're much less likely to go to the hospital and clog them up. Either way, all you're doing is maybe buying some time with these extreme measures, but not significantly altering the course of the pandemic. In effect, of all these mitigation measures, they fall hardest on our youth. They are the ones who need socialization the most. They are the ones who need interactions with others the most. They need interaction with learning. I'd argue that right now our greatest generation is our youth. Gen Z and Gen Alpha, which I had to look up because I didn't know what the generation was after Z, as they have given up the unique experiences in high school sports, graduations, dances, gatherings, the arts, in order to protect the elderly in our society. They have given up so much, and we must recognize that and always ask ourselves, how much more do we need them to sacrifice to slow the spread of an inevitable disease? We have become so locked into thinking that we need a zero COVID strategy to slow the spread that we've forgotten that that was only supposed to last as long as it took to protect those who wanted protection. We've gotten there, and now it's time to allow those who want to isolate to go do it, and let everyone else go about their lives.
Thanks for listening to The Paradox. If you like what the doc is doing, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. And share the show with your friends. Become a supporting listener to get access to special bonuses at patreon.com/theparadox. Show notes can be found at theparadox.com.